Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a show about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
I'm Jeremy Jimenez, professor in the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department. And as this is our inaugural episode, episode 1, I thought it might be interesting to get a little bit more on our backgrounds, how we ended up here. So, Eric, why don't you kick us off and tell us how'd you end up a professor at the university in which we both teach?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll start my little narrative here in high school. And I won't say much about that time period except that I had really no direction. And I, despite ending up as a college professor of physics, I slept through most of my high school physics courses. I took it in my senior year, first period. I was up very late with my girlfriend the night before. Post high school, I stayed in my hometown, worked at a bakery, rode my mountain bike a lot, smoked a lot of weed, and had an interesting experience. Maybe I'll save that for another time. But eventually I figured out that I wanted to go to college and study mathematics, but felt mathematics was a little too abstract, wanted something more applied, and so physics was the logical choice. I went off to the college nearest to my hometown, which was Chico, California, and studied there. Ended up double majoring in physics and math, and really busted my ass there, and did well on the GREs, had good letters of recommendation, got into a number of good graduate schools, ended up at MIT for my graduate work, and really suffered through 6 years and made it through. It was certainly a growing experience and a transformative experience. And looking back on it, I can say that, in all honesty, which is, I think, one of the goals of this show here in general, is to kind of be honest about academia. I was not a great graduate student. I got through and put together a thesis, got out, and I was very happy to get out. I think one of the reasons I was so unhappy was that I knew when I was an undergraduate that I wanted to teach. And so I went into graduate school knowing that my path always was going to take me back to education. I didn't find a deep love of research, at least not the kind of research I was doing then. But due to life circumstances, I didn't escape from research. I actually ended up in a postdoctoral position at a Department of Energy lab in Princeton, New Jersey, the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. And I further burned out on research. I kind of thought maybe just a new start would help, but it didn't really. And a couple of years into that, I was ready to give up. And
well, it's interesting that you would think based on your resume that you love research and that you're fully on that track, but it's interesting to hear you had this very different experience.
This was what kind of became a problem, is that when you have MIT on your resume and then you have Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, people just see Princeton, and then you're applying to small schools like where we teach, SUNY Cortland or other small liberal arts schools. I think sometimes, especially with the state schools, my impression and my guess is that maybe people think, oh, he's just applying here as a backup, or he doesn't really want to. Maybe he just wants a competing. This is a stepping stone for him. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I had dabbled in applying for academic jobs around that time, and I didn't get many bites. I was also very deeply unhappy with life in general at that point, and that maybe that was reflected in my applications. I don't know.
Academia draws such people.
Yes, it does, yeah. So I took kind of an unorthodox move at that point when I was a postdoc. I read through all the HR policies at the lab, and I found that you can take a leave of absence. So I paused my pay at the lab, and, well, prior to doing that, I had applied for a temporary teaching position, or a number of them, and I got an offer from Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo in California, which I'd never been to, but I'd seen photos and heard stories, and to me it was like the Shangri-La. It was like my dream place. And I went and I taught out there for a couple quarters, and it was, I think still is in my mind, the most beautiful place on earth. I had a wonderful experience there. Again, transformative experience for me. It was what I needed at that point in my life. But the big thing was that I finally got teaching experience on my resume. Prior to then, it had all been research. I came back from that, life happened, relationships, complications, etc., and ended up working back at MIT for a while and got a grant through the Department of Energy to work on this project in Germany. Started applying for academic jobs, got a few bites, ended up getting an interview at SUNY Cortland and got an offer and started here in 2017, the same year that you started. So we came in the same cohort together.
Yeah, and it was actually a nice party year. They hired a lot of new faculty that year, and we actually used to go out a lot those first few years until COVID struck. And I think we also had the honor of going to our last party on the eve of COVID, and just kind of sensed that this might have been the end for the while.
Yeah, I remember talking about it there. Yeah, we had a pretty good crew and a good time in our first couple of years. So, Jeremy, what's your personal journey through academia?
Well, my pre-adult years were spent in various cities in Hudson County, New Jersey, predominantly immigrant communities that have come in waves. So to some extent, you could estimate how old someone is by asking where their parents are from. Like the cities of Hudson County had waves of immigrants that were Polish, Italian, and then my father and many other immigrants came from Cuba in the 1950s and 60s, then Dominicans and Colombians, and more recently Palestinians. So that's like where the area I grew up in. But my story will actually start in second grade. Math always came to me very easily. And I remember we had this math workbook for the year, this whole big book. And sometime in November, I finished the book, right? Because it just came very intuitive to me. And the teacher found out that I finished it. She screamed at me, pulled my hair. Yes, teachers got away with this, even then in the 80s. And gave me detention for a week. And yelled at me saying, like, what are you going to do for the rest of the year because you finished the book already? So
Wonderful.
So that early on kind of turned me off to schooling completely for a while. I don't think I actually recovered a love of learning until 10th grade social studies. Mark McClellan, who just was a great teacher and got me interested in learning again. But yeah, so I was kind of a slacker and just coasted through, but I did well enough and I got better progressively as high school went on to get my grades up to get into Rutgers University, where I actually entered as a music chemistry double major. I was always much more into science, and the chemistry, my father was in biology and chemistry, and my mother was a music teacher, so I think that's where those influences came. But I was also in all-state band in high school, and I saw like how people from my community didn't really go to all-state band. I was the only person from Hudson County for all the years I was in all-state band. And I saw also what other schools in New Jersey look like. Like my low-income urban schools, like we didn't even have toilet paper in the bathroom. And I got to see what these like rich suburban New Jersey schools were like. And so my first year, I wasn't really finding the engineering and science classes really interesting and engaging. The professors weren't engaging. And at the same time, had this growing understanding of inequality and like how most people where I came from don't go to college. You know, I remember people being so excited graduating high school, like it was such a big deal. And so I kind of shifted to social sciences, seeing that would kind of more address issues of equity that I was personally observing and noticing. And so, I ended up double majoring in history and psychology, followed up by a master's degree in social studies education, following my mother's path of being a public school teacher. Then I went on to be a social studies teacher in a suburban public high school in New Jersey for a couple of years. During those summers, I found that there's great opportunities, and to some extent still are, for public school teachers in the U.S. to be able to go abroad for free in like teaching research capacity. So through these summer trips, I went to Korea, Germany, Afghanistan, Japan, and what was then called Swaziland. But then in 2004, George Bush won again, and I was just really depressed about that Americans, were not rejecting him for the Iraq war and the corruption and all the other things, all the way I felt he was taking this country in a terrible direction. So I said, I'm going to be in American exile for the remaining 4 years of his presidency. So I decided, where can I go that I will find a welcome community that would also be opposed to Bush, and that was Venezuela. I should also say that it didn't take me long to become also very disenamored of socialismo del siglo XXI. Yeah, I mean, left, right, corruption is corruption, right? And Chavez is also a disaster in many ways. But I spent 4 years teaching at international schools there. And then I got actually a really cool opportunity. It's called the Fulbright Roving Scholar Grant. Most Fulbright Scholar grants, you have to already have a PhD, but this program in Norway catered to people with master's degrees who taught at high school. And so every week I went to a different community in Norway and taught and gave presentations in the community based on invitation, and literally went to 50 different towns and cities across Norway.
And really quickly, what kind of things do you present?
So I prepared a presentation on immigration. Healthcare was big that year with the whole Obamacare, so I did a whole presentation on what's kind of unique about the American healthcare system. I also had topics on religion, which wasn't too popular. The immigration one and the healthcare ones were by far the most common ones I was asked to present to. And so then afterwards, I was like, wow, I'm really into this whole international education thing, both Venezuela and Norway, and the little short trips over the summer. So I decided to start a international comparative education program at Stanford, and that's where I went to get my PhD. I spent a little over 5 years there, and then I was lucky enough to get a job right in the get-go that I applied. Applied straight out of my dissertation a few weeks later, went on my interview, and I ended up at SUNY Cortland.
Very different than mine.
I had a much earlier love of math and science. It was really about it, and then it had it
Yeah.
extinguished by a teacher. And then yours was kind of wasn't there as strong, but then activated later. But I think we're both pretty content here. We're both now tenured faculty members, so I think we'll see what happens with the future of higher education, which we'll be discussing on the show. But we'd like to imagine we'd stay at our job for many years to come. But why don't we talk about what this whole podcast is about? So I think basically what we're hoping to do is to give some insight about what it's like to be a faculty member here in the United States, what higher education is all about, describing what it's been historically, what's happening now, as well as speculate about its future, if any future at all.
One of my goals is also to comment on what it's like to be a professor in an academic institution. And one of the reasons why I want to do this is I think that there's kind of a mystique about institutions of higher education, and professors are kind of viewed as these kind of mysterious creatures that, work till all hours of the night and drink ungodly amounts of coffee and come in and deliver magical lectures, or maybe not, depending on your experience. But I think there's kind of a view in the public at large that we're kind of very different. And so part of that, I think, is to try to demystify the experience a little bit and try to give people kind of a peek behind the curtain.
And and I think too there is a stereotype, which there is certainly some truth of it, of the professoriate generally leaning left, generally leaning liberal. And so one of the things I think we have to add is that neither of us really fit the perfect mold of that script. We don't think either political party well represents our interests or anyone's interests. And so one of the unique things we have to add is that we in many ways differ from what might be considered stereotypes type of what the professors believe and should believe. And we also, of course, have some differences among ourselves, which we hope will come out in our conversations.
Yeah, very much. I think you're exactly right that there tends to be a strong left-leaning bias in institutions of higher ed. Although, interestingly, you hear people debate that and question that. Every time I hear that, I always think, what planet are you on, right? Of course,
I think especially now, it might be the only institution where you kind of have a notable leftward liberal leaning of the most people in the profession. And I can't think of any other institution or field in the United States where that would be true.
Where it's so strong, yeah. The fact that you and I don't really identify strongly with a political party or a political philosophy per se, I think is important for the goal of this show, which is to, as I mentioned earlier, kind of peel back the curtain and get a look behind academia, and also be self-critical and reflective of both what we're doing well and our shortcomings. Yeah. And there are plenty of those. And I feel that academia in general is not good about disclosing and being really honest about what we could do better or what is not working in education. Right. And we hear lots about the problems in elementary school, in high school education. Those same problems exist in the college world too.
And so we're going to be talking about a whole lot of variety of topics. Some of the things we're going to talk about in this show will be the enrollment demographic cliff, the idea that it's believed that this year might be peak enrollment for many colleges across the United States, and what that means as colleges increasingly closed due to lack of funding, lack of tuition, lack of students, and what that means for institutions broadly, as well as perhaps ours. We'll be talking about Trump's win and how that's significantly impacting higher education. It's actually, in a way, it's almost interesting to be more privileged to be in a smaller state school because we're not as heavily dependent on federal grants. And so, I think in many ways our school isn't as dramatically impacted as are a lot of elite institutions who have funding apparatuses that are highly dependent on a large amount of federal grants for their doctoral programs and doctoral students and things like that.
Interesting you mentioned that. I was just chatting with the person I know today who works at Cornell, and she was saying that she's not even sure that she's going to spend any time applying for new grants this year because it's such a crapshoot like maybe it's not even worth her time to pursue further funding.
Yeah, I remember like our school, like many schools, got a lot of threatening messages during COVID about like, oh, we got to tighten the belts and we got to cut the budgets to make ends meet. I haven't seen any of that forthcoming yet, but I hear it happening with all of my colleagues at like R1s. And R1, by the way, means kind of like your elite research universities, including our neighbor Cornell. That's having hiring freezes and rescinding offers to students and things like that. We'll also be talking about, as part of the Trump attempt to rewrite, perhaps shut down much of higher ed, diversity, equity, inclusion, what that has meant and what that will mean in the future. Free speech on campus, and by that we'll be both talking about to what extent speech is officially stifled, may be stifled, as well as self-censorship, the idea that a lot of faculty might not be officially restricted from speaking, but because of cultures and norms on campus might avoid certain topics. Sustainability is a topic we're also big about. We teach a lot about it. We research a lot and write a lot about it. So we'll be talking about what that means, sustainability on campus, where we have, I believe, a particularly critical view of that word and how it's generally used. Yeah, other topics come to mind?
Within the classroom, I think there's plenty that we could talk about in terms of our observations. Things like grade inflation, problems with students and like kind of their approach to work.
The reading apocalypse,
Yes,
the idea
reading,
that
yeah.
apparently and this has been my experience, every semester I've assigned less reading especially since COVID, and every semester I've got about the same complaints about there being too much reading, right? So there just seems to be a downward shift in what students are willing to read, and there's different reasons for that. Some of that could be blamed on the COVID lockdowns and how that really, disrupted the education trajectory. Some of it could be the tech distractions. Some of it could be mental stress and anxiety.
Just to briefly touch on a political issue here, there's a lot that I disagree with how the Trump administration is approaching things. And I think that the Musk and Trump approach to taking a chainsaw to government and cutting out institutions like the Department of Education, I don't believe is the right way to approach things. That being said, I also don't think that they're wholly wrong. I'm not, again, saying that they're right, but I think we have seen that there are systemic issues, and one might even almost say failures in education. And it's not clear to me when I look at it critically that things like the Department of Education are actually pushing us in the right direction. Yeah. I'm not sure that things would be better without them, but I think there is more that we could be doing to try to uphold and turn things in a better direction.
Right. There are legitimate critiques of what is happening in higher education, how it's funded, what its trajectory are for the future, how it's teaching students. But what Trump and Musk have done is their assault on it. They're kind of taking the truth, factual basis of the problems with higher ed, and they're using that as a hatchet to completely shut it down. Yeah. And I suspect not at all for any concern for anyone's welfare, but their own potential to profit and to just, shrink the size of government, either to just have less people that could put up roadblocks to what they want to do, or just to have more ability to give more tax cuts to their rich friends.
I take a slightly different view, and who knows what they really think, right? I suspect that they have a sincere belief. Now, it might not be based in fact and reality, but I think they have a sincere belief that government is corrupt and that their duty, almost like their God-given duty here, is to ferret out the corruption and the misuse of funds and to try to establish kind of a new order for government, and that this is part of a house cleaning thing. But I'm not sure that it's all corruption in that they're doing this as some sort of larger scheme to enrich themselves.
I think many Americans have that view, and that is what in part they were elected on, is the ability to deliver on that view, to get more efficiency, cut out the waste, etc. So I think that's an appealing message to Americans. And again, many Americans would like to see their leaders address that issue, but I don't think they have any interest at all in the welfare of Americans. I think they simply use that as a wave to ride to achieve their own agenda. And again, I want to be clear, I don't think Democrats are much better in caring about the welfare of American people either. But I think all politicians are excellent at riding waves of discontent to as avenues to power. But I think what's unique with Trump and Musk is the blatant way in which they are pursuing these objectives for their own profit. I mean, Elon Musk is not at all hesitating on having agencies that are investigating his companies shut down. Trump, firing people that were investigating him. Right? They're very clear that they're pursuing their personal interests on the wave of this American discontent with
That's true. Yeah, I agree with you on that. But what appears to me to be slightly different is that they could have ridden this wave of discontent through the elections, got into the seat of power, and then not pursued it further. But they're going full force into this, like they believe it with deep conviction. And I don't know, what does Elon Musk get? I mean, okay, so maybe he receive great profits from everything that's happening here. It might also not work in his favor if he loses electric vehicle contracts with the government. This could actually maybe be a net loss for him in the long run. So when I look at what he's doing, I see someone who seems to be putting in a huge amount of volunteer work with not a clear return. Maybe I'm very naive here about what's actually happening and how things are working and the kind of the handshakes that happen behind closed doors.
What will be inserted in this segment later is research done into how much Elon Musk has made since Trump has won the presidency. I don't have those numbers available, but those will be inserted here.
That would be interesting.
Now, I want to be very clear. I think Trump is an absolutely deplorable human being, and I think he only 100% has the interests of him and his cronies in anything he does. That being said, it doesn't mean that everything he does is automatically bad policy.
Exactly.
And so
which makes it really confusing to wade through all of these things.
Right, and I think
especially if you come in with an ideological opposition to things.
And I think that's the problem, is the blindness, is that the inability to kind of say, like, I can say, I don't believe he does anything other than for his own interest. It doesn't mean, therefore, though, that everything he does is automatically bad, right? Yeah. And I think that's what we hope to address. So that's just, I believe, a sample of some of our discussions and even minor disagreements on these issues.
But I want to add in one more thing that I really would like to do with this podcast here, and that'll be my last thought for the evening. I really would like to, at some point, bring in other faculty members, maybe just to talk about their research, maybe to talk about their particular perspectives on higher ed. But also, I think this is really important. It will be really interesting. Bring in students.
Absolutely, yeah.
And get the student perspective of the time. Look, and I don't care if a student wants to do it anonymously, right? But whatever. Let's have an honest discussion with a student about what it's like to be in the classroom, how much they use AI, how much they use things like Chegg. Do they actually ever pick up a textbook and read it like we're talking about?
What are their social lives like? Yeah. I remember, so in our program, we had mostly females, elementary education teachers. And so I had once asked, like, one class, so there's no boys in this particular class. Like, do you wish there were, like, men in this class? So you have, like, the male perspectives. And, like, one female said, and many nodded and laughed in agreement, like, they don't talk, so it's not like we would get to know what they're saying anyway. So that their kind of perspective on the gender issues, and it's
multiple aspects of the gender dynamic on campus, right? The decrease in male enrollment.
And even I'd be curious what they have to say about Trump, because it was interesting. On election day, I went to campus, or the day after when it was clear that Trump had won. Basically, every former student I had told me they didn't vote. They're all very good. I didn't vote. And I was like, and at first I just believed each one individually. And then I got home and I read an article that said that half of college students lied about their behavior on election day. And I was like, actually, I wonder if some of those students voted for Trump, but assumed professors would be appalled and angry and judging them. And so it's the safer route is to just say, I didn't vote. So I'd be very curious to hear, because there is this assumption shift of like, young people always vote Democrat. And I forgot what the numbers are, but more young people voted for Trump in this past election than in the previous time.
Well, there's also a growing a pattern that more young men are turning conservative, whereas young women are turning or are kind of staying more liberal, right? So there's a growing gender divide. In the political views as well.
And also, just another issue for college is the fact that there's so many less men going to college to begin with, is another topic. So I hope that this teaser was intriguing enough for you to come back for another listen in the future.
So we're going to try to release episodes about once a week, at least during the academic year. Most likely we'll probably take a break over the summer. And if you listeners out there have any thoughts, questions, suggestions, topics for shows you'd like to hear about, let us know. Drop a note in the comment and we'll take a look.
And yeah, we look forward on going this journey together.
Yeah. All right, Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Eric, always a pleasure.
All right, everyone. Good night.